Well, it's 17 degrees outside on this cold, cold morning, but that's not going to stop me from making one of the best briskets in the world. And I'm going to break up this video into parts like I normally do. Show you guys how to do the trim, show you how to smoke it, how to cook it, how to know when to wrap, what to wrap with, and also how to slice it, how to know when it's done. So, alright, so here it is. This is the brisket. So this is a prime grade brisket that I bought yesterday, so it hasn't been frozen, just refrigerated. Let it sit out a little bit this morning. Like to let it get a little bit to temperature, and that really helps with cooking to help it cook a little bit quicker. It does make it a little bit harder to trim, but that's okay. So some things that I like to look for on a brisket is just the fat cap on top. Make sure it looks normal. Make sure it looks natural. You want to look for any like abnormal growth. Make sure it doesn't look different. Make sure it doesn't look like it's been modified or enhanced or anything like that. Just want to find a brisket that looks natural. Looks like it just grew up the way it's supposed to, and it looks like it just kind of, doesn't have any like growth hormones or wasn't forced to grow in a way that's abnormal, just in any way. So just regular fat, look for fat, like white fat, good fat all the way across the top. Especially in a prime grade, you're going to find good fat all the way across the top. You're also going to find just the marbling in the meat. That's really what makes any beef prime grade is the meat itself. If you ever want to, you can always get choice grade too. Just try to look for a choice grade that has good marbling in it. Look for a choice grade that's more like on the high end. And you can still make some pretty good stuff, An idea I guess I just had for a video, maybe one day I'll make a video where I'll make a choice grade and a prime grade, compare the two, so that y'all can see what the difference is and what it looks like. So I'm going to show you how I do my trimming. I do my trimming different than a lot of people, probably cut off a lot more than what most people do. But I found the way that I trim is the best for me and works the best for me, so I'm going to go ahead and show that. Just for reference too, this is a 16-pound brisket, so a little bit bigger than I normally go with. Normally I try to stick with 15 pounds at the most, but this is the best one that I could find at the store that looked natural, that looked normal, so this is the one that I went with. Let's get started with the trimming. So I like to really look at trimming my meat in a way that I don't like to keep things that I'm not necessarily going to eat if I don't have to. So a lot of times I'll start on the bottom, start just by trimming away some of this fat right here, across the bottom of it. Just try to get this trimmed down. It's not really necessary, it's just going to drip into the bottom of the pit and make it so that it's just a waste, And fat, in my experience, doesn't really absorb smoke flavor. It blocks smoke flavor from getting into the meat. The meat is where we want the flavor. The meat is where that flavor is most impactful. So just kind of try to trim up some of the fat, trim up some of the corners. With an offset smoker like mine, you got to think that the air is flowing over the top of it. So the top is where most of the heat's going to be, but also I want to make it so that this thing is shaped so that the air can flow freely and smoothly over the entire thing. I don't want to make it so that air is going to stop flowing anywhere across this thing. I trim up a lot of the edges. Any pieces that are hanging off, I'll trim as well, like this piece right here. And you can, all these trimming pieces, and you can reuse them. You can put them in beans if you want to. You can make sausage out of them. Whatever you want to do. You can use the fat to make tallow with. But in any case, the important thing is that we just don't. We want to put all of our focus into putting the flavors, putting the meat, putting the juiciness into the meat that we're actually going to eat. So for me, I find cutting off the parts that are going to dry out and are not going to be good. I don't want to waste any of my flavors, any of my smoke, any of my heat on those things. I want to put all that into what I'm actually going to eat. I don't want to put it in anything that I'm going to cut off later on. So, and something too that I look for in a brisket is I look at the flat. You know, try to find one that's thicker, it's bigger. That's always good too. If you get one like this part here on the end here is like thin, sometimes you'll get them where like it's thin for like halfway. You know, and that's probably a waste because you're not going to use all that. Most of that it's going to dry out. So something to look here on the side. This is cauterized, so this is where they cut it from the breastbone of the cow. So this one, if you look at it like this is how it was on the cow, just like this. And this right here is where the breastbone was. So this is actually a left side brisket. A lot of people think that matters. For me, I don't think it does. But what I like to do is trim off this whole side where it was cauterized. I don't really want that cauterized meat being used or going in the smoker. I don't think it's great. I think, you know, it's the natural process of what happens, but cauterized meat to me just doesn't sound very good. I want to make it so that this is as good as possible. Something that I personally never do is I never inject brisket. I never inject beef in general. I feel like it's a crime to inject something that has such fantastic natural flavoring without being injected. So I always try to make it with my cooking, especially with beef and with brisket. The natural flavor is really what stands out the most with my meats. And with brisket, there's a whole lot of natural flavor in it that we really just want to try to bring out if we can. And I get that there's a lot of people that don't like to trim their briskets. They just, you know, cut up in the package, pull them out, season them, and throw them in. For me, I just found that that's not always the best choice. That it's better to trim it, better to make it so that everything can flow really well. Get rid of a lot of the excess fat that really isn't needed. That's just going to block. It's just going to block smoke. It's not actually going to do anything to enhance the meat or the flavor. And if you're somebody that doesn't, you know, that loves that ton of meat and all those things, like, by all means, keep it that way. But for me, I like aerodynamically sound so the air can flow over it. I'm honestly not a huge fat person, so I like to trim off probably more fat than a lot of people do. But so here's what I do, and then I just go through here, start trimming up. See all this fat? This is just like a block of solid fat. That right there is blocking smoke. So, you know, try to get it so that like along the flat, it's about a 1/4 inch thick on the fat. There's still quite a bit there. Probably trim off this end over here that's thinner. It doesn't have as much meat to it because it's just not going to work. Oh, you know, and the knife that I use is a boning knife. I try to get just a razor sharp, super sharp knife. I like the boning knife, I like the shape of it because it's just easy to dig in and slice and cut. But really any sharp knife is going to work. Just make sure that it's not dull, and you should be okay. If it's dull, you might have a hard time trimming a brisket, so maybe could be a good reason to not. Oh, went a little too deep there. That's okay. You know, we can compensate for that for sure. Not a big deal. But anyways, you know, something I was mentioning. You know, if you want to, if you really feel like you just have to inject your brisket or marinate it or whatever, To me, again, I really feel like that's just a crime. But if you really feel like you want to, you need to, I would say just go with something that's like natural beef flavoring. Maybe mix some broth with some apple cider vinegar. You know, cider vinegar is a really great thing to mix with brisket. Anything acidic is going to be great, or sorry, with a rub. No, not with brisket, with a rub. And the reason why is because once those acids get into the meat, they will start to break down and separate the proteins and break them down from the fibers of the meat. And then what happens is that allows those proteins to merge together. When those proteins merge together, they're going to seal in juices, seal in flavoring inside the meat. So cider vinegar, that's even what happens with wine. Same kind of things happening with wine. You're breaking down those proteins and you're saving them, and you're making them combine so that it creates more juiciness, more desirable flavors. So I flip this around so that I can see this fat cap and kind of see where it begins and ends on the meat, so we don't go too far down. And this is really it. And we're just kind of going through and trimming it up, and you kind of get to the point where the fat looks almost like cotton candy a little bit. So right here is like super thin. So this I'm going to just go ahead and cut out. Isn't going to be good, isn't going to last the cook. So pile it up there. And then I'll cut this off here just to make it more symmetrical. Don't want any end pieces drying out. I feel like that one's just going to dry out sitting there. So right here we've already got about 1/4 inch. Good there. Let's see. And it's okay if you have like a few spots that you trim a little too much. Obviously, ideally you don't want to do that, but it happens. It's not going to be perfect, but we are going to try to make this be as good as we possibly can. I'm really trying to kind of get this hump down a little bit, just because I feel like that could cause some restrictions. And I want to make sure like it's going to cascade, like it's going to float all the way down. I want to try to avoid juice puddling right here, right? So make it so it just looks smooth. It's going to go all the way down. It's going to flow. And we're going to be able to render this fat really well without compromising the bark and without disrupting any of our natural flavoring to the meat itself. This one's about done trimming. Just really want to look and see how this looks. And by the way, this is a whole brisket. What that means is we have the point here and we have the flat here. The point is kind of like a big, huge ball of meat and fat. It's typically it is the most tender, the juiciest part. It's got the most marbling in it. This over here is the flat. This is typically what you see like at a restaurant that they'll serve. Usually just fat on the top and then not much fat in the actual meat itself. It's more lean. A lot of restaurants use the point for like nachos, and they can throw it in beans also. That sort of thing. For me, I know a lot of people like to cook just flats. I know some people that'll buy a whole brisket and then they'll cut it in half, or even try to cut sideways along the. If you look right here, there's a fat seam that runs right here. That's what connects the point to the flat. These are really two different muscles, two different kinds of meat. That's one of the things that makes brisket difficult to cook, is that you're cooking two dissimilar types of cuts of meat. So they cook differently, they react differently. They cook differently, they react differently, they taste differently. They taste different for sure, but it makes it difficult. And a lot of people will try to cut the brisket in half if they can, and or even along the fat seam, and they'll try to cook the flat separate from the point. In my experience, I find it's best to cook a whole brisket with them intact, because what I find is that it'll really help to tenderize and make the flat juicy. I feel like that a lot of the fat and a lot of the juices in the point are going to melt and flow into the flat and make the flat more tender and more juicy. I find that when I cook the flat by itself, that it actually kind of dries it out a little bit, and it's not as good as it could be, for sure. So I've just got a little bit more fat over here to try and get off, and then we'll do some seasoning to put our rub on it. And by the way, I have the smoker outside. It's already lit. It's going right now. Got it so that it's warming up while I'm doing all of this. Normally I can do this much faster, but of course I'm slowing down to try and explain everything to y'all and to show you guys how I do things. So I've got this thing trimmed up. Doesn't look too bad. Got a few spots that I kind of went a little too far. Again, that's okay. You put a little bit extra seasoning on there to protect it, and usually it'll be just fine. Typically, I do the fat side up in my smoker, just because I have an offset where the air flows over the side. I find that most of the heat usually goes over the top of the meat, so I want to use this fat to try to. I'm actually using it to protect the meat from overheating and from burning. So, if you use a pellet smoker or a smoker where the most of the heat's on the bottom, you can actually flip this over upside down. Or fat side down to protect the meat. That way, use the fat to protect the meat. It's the best thing you can do with the fat on a brisket. Okay, so I got all the seasonings. Got my mustard. Mustard I'm going to use to make the surface tacky to help keep the rub to stick to the meat. I don't ever pre-season this. I don't ever dry brine my briskets. Again, I like to just keep them nice and natural if I can. Let the flavor of the beef itself stand out. I'm actually going to cut a little bit more fat off of this now that I can see it better on this side. Try to get rid of this unnecessary stuff. It's not going to be great after it's cooked. Okay, oh, and just this hand right here is clean. This knife handle's always been clean, so I make it a point not to touch the meat with my right hand, even when it is gloved. Glove is just a precaution. So, anyways, I like to just use plain old mustard for my briskets. Not a whole lot of it, just a very thin amount, and then just spread it around. So just enough to get the surface tacky, make it sticky. You're not going to taste this in the cook. You're not even going to know it was there. The smoke is totally going to overpower it. And I like to use for my rub just good old salt and pepper. I use coarse ground pepper. Restaurant grinds, what the bottle says, but it's coarse ground. You can use cafe grind, 16 mesh, whatever it says. There's lots of different things it'll say on the bottle, but it's all coarse ground. And then kosher salt. I just use an even mixture, half and half salt, half pepper. Again, I like to make it so that just the flavors of the actual beef, the actual meat, stand out. I don't want to do anything to change that. So I really just want to use the rub to create a texture on it and to create a good bark. Pepper is going to really help with the bark the most. That's why I use the thicker, more coarse ground pepper. Coarse ground pepper, kosher salt, that creates texture on the meat. Texture on the meat is actually going to attract smoke, attract good flavors of the smoke, and it's going to really create a nice bark on this. And it's also going to create good smoky flavor. So a lot of people like to mix in, a lot of different things as well, like garlic and onion. And in my experience, what's going to really make the biggest difference is the quality of smoke you put this thing through. The quality of cook, the consistent temperatures is really what's going to matter. I mean, this thing is going to sit in the smoker for 10, 12, 13, 14, sometimes up to 16 hours. Anything you do to it, you know, you put a hint of garlic in it, or a tablespoon or a teaspoon of onion powder or whatever in your rub, it's going to be, a lot of that's going to be nullified just by the smoke itself, and it's not really even going to be flavorful, and it's not really going to make a difference. What makes the biggest difference on brisket is consistent temperature, one, and then clean smoke. So you have that good, clean, smoky flavor. With a brisket, we don't want to over season it. Don't want to put too much rub on it. Just enough to make it so that we can get that bark going on it. So, but we do want to get it all the edges all the way around. So I'll go ahead and do that on the sides that I can for now. Season that little fat piece right there a little bit extra. See if we can get that to have some good flavoring too. Okay. So we've got what for me is going to be the bottom side all seasoned up. Now flip this bad boy over. Mustard on top. Again, not a ton, just enough so we can spread it around, get the surface nice and tacky. Oh, and when you're kind of trimming up your brisket too on top and the fat on top, you know, kind of the consistency you want to look for is you want it to be kind of like cotton candy almost, just like nice and soft and pliable. And it looks and kind of feels like cotton candy almost a little bit. That's kind of the best way I can describe it. So, again, we don't want to go. The one thing about brisket is it is possible to over season it, and when you over season it and you go to bite it, you'll know. So, just a decent amount of seasoning, but just get it on there. Don't want to go crazy, and it's good. You know, you don't want to go back and forth, and like use like the buzzsaw thing over it. Just get it on there. And then do your sides. So we can kind of do the front of this brisket a little bit heavier. That'll really help to protect it from the heat. Because this side right here for me is going to be facing the firebox, so that's going to take the brunt of that heat. So keep that a little bit more seasoned. Help to try to protect that if we can. Get these ends. Just get the sides seasoned. Again, all we're doing is we're just seasoning this to try and, you know, a little bit of flavor on the outside, but we're really just trying to make that really, really good bark that everybody loves and wants. So, just kind of hit it. I like to use my hand, and then what I'll do is I'll kind of put it on my hand and then or on the glove side right there, and then I'll just press it in to the meat with my glove. And that's the best way to actually get the sides seasoned. Okay, this brisket is trimmed and it is seasoned. Now it's just a matter of waiting for the cooker or the offset outside to get to the temp that I need it to be at. It's actually got a little bit hotter than I needed to, so I need to let it cool back down, but you know, it was cold outside. Again, it's 17 degrees outside, so I really wanted to get a big fire in there, get that meat warmed up, get the air warmed up, so that when I put this in there, it's not going in there on a cold grate and a cold air, cold smoker. I want it to be warm and stay warm. Keep it warm all throughout. I will put a temp gauge. I've always just put it kind of right here in the thickest part of the point, I know a lot of people put it in the flat, some people put it in the middle where the flat goes into the point. For me, I found that it's best for me just to put it right here. Put it here, plus right here is where the air is going to flow over. I use a meter thermometer, temp probes. So that temp probe right here has the ambient temperature, so when I put it here, I can know the exact temp when the air is at its hottest. I can monitor that at any time to make sure that it's consistent up there, but also to make sure it never gets too hot. Again, for me, I don't use the temperature to know when the meat is done. I use it to help monitor the meat, help to monitor the status of it, the cook, how it's coming along, help to make sure that I'm keeping an eye on it. Ultimately, we're going to go off of feel. I'm going to pick this thing up with some barbecue gloves and feel it to know when it's ready to go. But we'll get to more of that later. For now, I'm just going to go outside, finish getting the fire ready, and get this thing on there.